In our last lesson, we talked about the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763 and was followed by a royal decree which separated the British from the Native Americans. But before that royal decree could actually happen, another conflict arose, and this was a particularly violent conflict that's called Pontiac's War. Although Pontiac was only one leader among many who were in the Indian resistance. Now, if you think about this from the Indian perspective, it gets pretty interesting. They had been allied with the French, and then all of a sudden, across the sea, the French and the British decide for peace. But nowhere is a Native American present at those peace conferences. And in fact, the British get all of this land that the French had claimed. And that land belongs to the Native Americans. So from their perspective, all of a sudden, their land changes hands, and they weren't involved at all. You can see how they would be upset. They were so upset that a war broke out, and many different tribes that had lived among, especially around the Great Lakes area, joined together. These tribes included the Ottawas, the Potawatomis, the Hurons, the Miamis, the Kickapoos, the Delaware, the Shawnees, and others. And they were often led by Pontiac and several other war leaders. The fighting took place in New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. Now, it's important to realize that British leaders in London had agreed that certain lands would belong to the Native Americans, and they had made that agreement as early as 1758, and they intended to honor it again in 1763. But despite what was happening in London, settlers in the 13 colonies wanted more land. Now, who were these Native American people? It's important not to lump them together. In general, three different groups comprised the Native Americans involved in Pontiac's War. The Great Lakes Indians were mostly spoke variations of Algonquin language. They were long familiar and comfortable with the French, and they were alarmed that the British soldiers suddenly moved into forts that had belonged to the French. The Illinois country tribes had long-standing trade relations with the French as well, and they were the furthest geographically from the British. They would fight the longest. The Ohio country tribes had been displaced from coastal regions pushed west over Appalachia by British growth and encroachment. They had a separate peace with the British from 1758, but the British colonists were unable to honor that agreement. The war broke out over several different reasons. The first one I mentioned was the British soldiers suddenly moving into the forts. The British leader at that time was General Jeffrey Amherst. He was in control of those forts in that region, and he famously called the Native Americans dogs. They didn't appreciate that at all. Further, culturally, gift-giving was a part of Native American lifestyle. It was believed that only a truly wealthy and powerful person could afford to give gifts. This had been part of the relationship with France. France was powerful. The Native Americans were powerful. They would give each other gifts as a show of power and of trust. But General Amherst ended the policy of gift-giving. This didn't make sense to the Native Americans. If Britain was so powerful, why were they no longer giving gifts? The British also began restricting access to gunpowder and ammunition. Now, the Native Americans had long traded for gunpowder and ammunition, and it had become part of their lifestyle. They were now hunting with gunpowder and ammunition. When the British began restricting access to those goods, it was actually threatening clan safety. They were no longer able to provide for their own people. And it also looked like disarmament, as if the British were making a move that was a prelude to war. Unlike the French, who had cultivated all equitable trade relations, the British saw the Native Americans as a conquered people. After all, they had lost the French and Indian War. What belonged to the losers now belonged to the victors, the British thought. That aggravated the situation as well. And then finally, there's a religious aspect. There was a Delaware prophet named Neolin, a Native American who began to preach that smallpox and alcohol, the two biggest killers of Native Americans, were the responsibility of the British. All of these reasons come together, and Pontiac decides to do a lightning strike against the British forts. Now remember, those forts had been held by the French, but had been turned over to the British after they lost the French and Indian War. The British moved in, usually with garrisons of like 20 to 30 soldiers, and initially the Native Americans were able to storm those forts and destroyed 8 of them. But when they came across the larger forts at Detroit and Fort Pitt, they were unable to win. Pontiac had been able to gather a large assortment of people, and it was an unusual Indian alliance, but he still was not able to take those 2 forts. His eventual goal was independence and land ownership for all the natives west of the Allegheny Mountains, a goal that was encouraged by the Seneca of New York. The fighting in this war was brutal, and it was contrary to European customs. The Native Americans attacked both women and children, and non-combatants such as farmers and traders were killed. When they took prisoners of war, they would sometimes kill these prisoners of war, and often through torture. There was also scalping and ritual cannibalism, and farms and homesteads were especially targeted. The British fared little better. Their response was also to kill the prisoners of war and also to give blankets that were laced with smallpox as a means of extermination. It was ineffective at the moment that they gave the blankets, but after this war concluded, there was a smallpox epidemic that ran through these Indian nations and decimated their numbers. Also in Pennsylvania, a small vigilante group called the Paxton Boys went on a killing spree as they began to target indiscriminately Native Americans, even those who had not been involved in the conflict at all. And Pennsylvania itself created a bounty for every native over the age of 10 who was killed. This was a brutal war, as I said, and it also drew a very clear contrast between what was permissible and what was not. It became very clear that the Native Americans could not live among the British, both sides guilty of a type of genocide. And so the decree of 1763 was hurried along as an effort to keep the peace. The British would stay on one side of the Appalachian Mountains, the Native Americans on the other side. However, that same decree angered British citizens who had hoped to make money speculating on that western land.